So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this course is to really give you an understanding of Irish history from sort of its shadowy mystical beginnings to the later medieval period, kind of ending in around the 1400s. Uh, this week we'll be starting with early Irish history, trying to understand the people who were the inhabitants of Ireland before they were the target of outside invaders. To support evidence for this lecture and for my PowerPoints, I'm using manuscript images, maps, primary sources, personal photographs, and then historical scholarship to sort of present you with the most coherent picture I can of ancient Ireland. And as I mentioned earlier, the primary source that I sent you all was a copy of the Táin, which is just a wonderful glimpse into pre-Christian Ireland. And it really gives you a perspective of the society and how it works and their religions and their myths, and just the importance of cattle culture as well. And an interesting note about the Táin before we start is that beyond that the Táin is the oldest epic tale in Western Europe that wasn't written in Latin or in Greek. So it's just a really old story, and it tells us so much about Ireland. So if you ever have a chance, I definitely suggest looking it over. And I do realize it's about 84 pages, so I understand. But as you can see from my slide here on the screen, I kind of have a pattern for how we're going to be going about the different weeks. And yes, we are going to have a 1 hour lecture and then another hour lecture on a Monday and a Tuesday. So this week we'll be starting off with prehistory Ireland to sort of set our stage and kind of set the foundation for the society that we'll be dealing with. Next week, we'll be talking about the invasion of the Christians, and then we'll be looking at the Viking invasions in our third week. Our fourth week, which apparently I deleted, it will be the Norman English invasions. The week after that, we'll be talking about the settlement of those English invaders and how much of a settlement was it and how much of it was the Irish changing those English settlers in kind of a reversal. And then our last week, we'll be kind of looking at the 1300s to the 1400s, where we're dealing with, the mini ice age, the Black Death plague, the 100 Years' War, all of those good horsemen of the apocalypse. So that's kind of the pattern for how this class will go. So I want to start with the earliest point that we have recorded evidence. There is archaeological evidence of hunters and fishermen living in Ireland as far back as 7000 BCE. In 1973, archaeologists uncovered a site at Mount Sandal, which is this map image that I'm showing over here. This site, they were digging up, they were excavating these pits that were dug for cooking fires. And within those, they found the remains of burnt hazelnut shells, and they were able to carbon date those back to about 7000 BCE. So we know there were people living in that area, as well as other coastal areas in Ireland. And you can see kind of here, these are images of what they believe that those settlement sites may have looked like. Pretty primitive, but at the same time, really engaging in the environment of Ireland. Moving on to a slightly later time period, the people who were living in Ireland during the Neolithic, the New Stone Age period, left huge megalithic structures like the one in the PowerPoint that I'm showing that's called Newgrange. Newgrange was probably built in around 3200 BCE. This impressive structure is older than Stonehenge by 1,000 years. It's at least 600 years older than the oldest pyramids in Egypt. Radiocarbon dating proves that there's bodies or the remains of bodies that have been placed inside this megalithic tomb that died between 3200 BCE and 2900 BCE. So we know that it was being used around those times. Newgrange is located north of Dublin and is called a Great Passage tomb. And it demonstrates that the Neolithic Irish had great artistic and construction skills, not to mention the fact that they obviously had a clear understanding of planetary activity and the movements of the sun and the solstices. What's really interesting about Newgrange is that on the winter solstice, a rivet of sunlight penetrates deep into the burial chamber, lighting the entire interior up, and it was built specifically for those purposes. And along with this amazing knowledge of planetary activity and the sun movements, Newgrange is known for some unique symbols that have not been found anywhere else where they were older, including this tri-spiral that I have a pattern here down at the bottom of the PowerPoint. And then at the top right corner of the PowerPoint, you'll see this large stone that actually was placed in front of the tomb. And they know that this is an original stone. And this tri-spiral is a really unique carving, and it's very unique to Ireland specifically. And it's believed to represent some sort of significance with sacred geometry, perhaps representing the sky, land, and the sea. But it's just a really interesting place. And you can see from some of the pictures here of Newgrange how they believed that these Neolithic people had built this using the tools that they had at their disposal. Newgrange is not the only megalithic tomb structure in Ireland with a clear connection to the knowledge of the movement of the sun. In northwestern Ireland, in Carramore, there are several stone structures dating from that early time period, including one similar to Newgrange that illuminates with the winter solstice. Carbon dating of red deer antlers found inside these tombs make them as old as 5800 BCE, so even older than Newgrange. But as you can see from the images, they are far simpler. And these are known as passage tombs or wedge tombs sometimes. And beyond the remains of red antler or red deer antlers, there are remains of many other people found within these cairns. They're believed that ancient peoples would bring the ashes of important people from their tribe, from their clan, that had died each year to be placed inside of these cairns during special celebrations throughout the year, probably with some sort of significance to the solstice. Each of these cairns is pointed in the direction of the rising sun at a certain significant solstice time, and they're all very interesting. And another important structure that has significance today is Tara Hill, which is where the High Kings of Ireland were once crowned. There are several ancient structures located at this site of Tara Hill, and you can see from the PowerPoint here that the middle picture with the two circles, that is Tara Hill. And then to the right of that, with that phallic-looking stone structure, is known as the King's Stone. I'll talk about that in a moment. So there's several other ancient structures located at the site of Tara Hill. The oldest is known as the Mound of Hostages, and that dates from 2000 BC. There's also another type of passage tomb that aligns with the sun during the festival of Samhain. That festival is on November 1st. And around the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, more building was done at this site that we know of. And that's where we have the placement of the Stone of Destiny, which is this image over here, that large stone, which became the stone upon which the High Kings of Ireland were crowned. According to legend, the stone would let out a roar if the king that had been crowned was an acceptable person for the high kingship. So beyond the structures, beyond these structures, it just really leaves a testament to the skills and knowledge of these ancient Irish people. Far more is known about the Celtic Gaels who arrived in Ireland around 700 BCE, more than their ancient predecessors. And a lot of that has to do with just the fact that the Celtic Gaels intermixed with the native Irish and their cultures and religions combined, and it's hard to sort of separate those two. It does not appear that this was an invasion of Celts to Ireland. In fact, Celt is more of a shared culture and religion than it is an actual ethnic group. What we know about the ancient Celtic pagan religion we owe to the Christian monks who wrote down the oral history of the Celts. And unfortunately, the oral history of the people who came before the Celts was just too old to be transferred on, or was, as I said, adopted into the Celtic history themselves. The Celts left more monumental structures on the European continent, but in Ireland, their oral history, their mythology was able to be preserved a lot better. And so combining our knowledge of what remains on the European mainland and the mythology that we have from the Celts in Ireland, we're able to get a more cohesive picture. And that's where a lot of the information I'll be talking about today is coming from. It's a combination of what we know about the Celts in Europe as well as the Celts in Ireland. The Romans also left a few accounts that are gathered from sailors who traveled to Ireland. The map that you're looking at in the PowerPoint was done by a Greek geographer from Alexandria, Ptolemy, who wrote an account of Ireland around 140 AD. That's partially based on earlier Roman accounts of the island. Ptolemy describes the geography of Ireland, the large rivers crisscrossing Ireland, and the various tribal kingdoms that ruled over various small regions. Most of these tribes were still represented in Ireland in 500 AD, and you can, someone who knows the Celtic language in Latin would be able to recognize some of those tribes on this map. And so we know that there was a certain amount of knowledge that was passed on there. So we're going to move on and talk about the early Irish Celtic religion, which was paganistic. They believed in many gods, nearly 400, probably more so. There was sun and earth worship, and there seemed to be some significance to the number 3, which that tri-spiral might be significant of as well. They believed that the human body had not just a body, but a soul and a spirit, so 3. That the world was made up of earth, sea, and air, that the world of nature was made up of animal, mineral, and vegetable. So there's a sort of an earlier version of the Trinity. And when we start talking about Christianity, we'll talk about how the significance of that lining up is. They believe that the world was controlled by many deities that embodied various aspects of nature. The highest god was known as Dagda, the destroyer, the preserver, and the creator, again, 3. And then the next important one was Danu, the mother goddess. She ruled over her children who made up the pantheon. They were known as the Tumana de Danu. And these were the lesser gods. Those were her children. Thinking of early Greek mythology is a good way to kind of understand the importance and the part that these Irish gods played in the daily life and the nature of the Irish people. They represented so much, and most people are pretty familiar with Greek mythology, and so it's a good example to kind of compare the two. The Celtic pantheon included Lugo, who is the god of light and crafts, and a harvest god. Then there was Bridget, who was the goddess of fertility and healing. We have a Morgane, who was a goddess of fate, and Serones, who was the lord of the wild things. You'll see him pictured sometimes with big antlers. Archaeologists have not discovered the physical remains of any religious temples or holy sites in Ireland, other than the passage tombs that we've already mentioned. This has led many archaeologists and historians to believe that the Celts did not worship in temples, but instead they practiced their faith in open areas of sacred forests and other natural sites according to the landscape. And this is backed up a little bit by reports of kings being crowned, that they go to sacred places in the forest for that. Part of the Celtic religion includes making animal and human sacrifices. And some of these human sacrifices have been found very well preserved in the Irish bogs. Other important discoveries that they found in these ancient bogs include gold hoards, sacred statues, coins, jewelry, and of course bodies. And one interesting thing is that they can carbon date some of these things that have been found in these bogs, and they can tell when these physical material sacrifices have been made, and it does time up in history with other evidence that maybe the environment or there had been some natural disasters going on. And so it shows us that these early people would sacrifice not only people, but material items to hopefully appease their gods and get better weather. I kind of wish that we could do that these days. Maybe not the human sacrifice part though. So going on, the stories of fairies, gnomes, leprechauns, sprites, all of these things that we kind of associate with Ireland they come from this pagan religion. And it's this idea that all of nature is imbued with a spirit, even the trees and the groves. They did believe in an afterlife, one similar to the Greeks' idea of the Elysian fields, or something that has been found in some written material called the island in the sea, which makes sense considering Ireland is an island, that their afterlife would be something similar. But it's also really clear that they have a concept of reincarnation and animal transformations as well. Religious sites and ceremonies were performed by a priestly class of druids. Now, druids were an educated elite that not only played an important role in religion, but they also acted as an all-around professional class who were educated in schools of some sort. Uh, from sources about Celtic tribes on the continent, we do know that Druids acted as physicians, advisors to the ruling class, and were authorities on the law. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that caste a little bit later. Like all the religions, the Celts had very special, a number of special holidays that they celebrated throughout the year. Um, their first, their calendar year started with the holiday of Samhain, which is November 1st. Now, this holiday marked the end of summer, when the veil between the worlds of gods and men was at the weakest. I think we all recognize this as the season we're in now, which is one of my favorites. And then the next special festival that they celebrate is called Imbolc, which is February 1st, and it marks the start of spring. This was a festival for farmers and the start of the lambing season for shepherds. The next festival is called Beltane, which happens on May 1st, very similar to our May Day. Now, this is a really important festival for the Celts. It is a festival to purify the cattle, and as we talk throughout today, we'll really learn how important cattle are to the Irish. This festival involves the Fire of Bel, where Druid priests would drive herds of cattle between two great bonfires to purify them against disease. And then the last holiday I want to talk about is the one of Lughnasadh, which occurs on August 1st, and it is a celebration of the marriage of the great harvest god Lugh with nature. And this actually is marking of the time to bring in the harvests, where the entire community would come together to bring the harvest in from the fields before those fall rains begin and the harvest is lost. I realize we haven't gotten very far, but I'm looking at the clock and it's 4 o'clock. So I just wanted to say, we're going to go for another 10 minutes, or excuse me, we're going to go for another 20 minutes, leaving about 10 minutes at the end of class for any questions that we might have, okay? Moving on to our next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about Irish society. Early Irish society was never a united one. There was never an idea of a united Ireland. Ireland was made up of upwards of 150 tiny kingdoms that had constantly shifting frontiers and borders. And each one of these little areas was ruled by a king or a chieftain or just by a large family. The population of Ireland pre-Christianity was maybe about 500,000, so it's pretty small. Ireland did have 5 recognized regions that in later times would become known as Ulster, Meath, Leinster, Munster, and Connaught. I want to talk a little bit about kingship in Ireland because that's kind of a fun topic. There are 3 grades of kings that we know of in early Irish society. A king, first and foremost, is known as a rí, and a king is the king of a tuath, and a tuath is a people, so it's a gathering of people. And the point I want to make about that is the king is not a king over a specific land. He is a king over a specific people. The early Irish, they're not completely nomadic, but they're not a completely settled people as well. We're going to talk a little bit about agriculture later in this lecture, but the clan, the people who make up the tuath are always kind of on the move, and so there aren't distinctive barriers that these kings rule over. And so they rule over a people as opposed to a land. So we have a Ri, who is our basic king, and he would be the king over a single Tua. And then a king over several petty Ris is known as a Ri Tua More. So he'd be a king over several other kings. And then a king over that is a king who's known as a king over one of the 5 provinces that I listed before: Connaught, Meath, Ulster. Now, those are known as the Pentarchy. And I'm going to be honest, I do not know how to say this next word. It is Seaseed. I don't know how to say it. I looked it up several times and I could not find a good description of how people were pronouncing it. So I wrote that down on the PowerPoint so you can take it down yourself. And then the highest king of Ireland is known as the High King of Tara. And again, there isn't always a High King of Tara. And in fact, it is the exception that there's a High King of Tara. Usually there isn't. But when there is, they are known as the Naher Erin, and they have essentially power over all of the other Ris. Now, lower Ris would provide hostages from their own personal family to their Ri Tua More to show as a surety of their fealty and loyalty. So there are connections there that ensure that you're loyal back and forth. These kings ruled from ring forts that I've got some examples over here on the slide, and they are truly ring forts. Now, these ring forts were built on the top of hills, usually overlooking the local arable land, or the land that the herds of the clan or the tribe are on. There have been at least 80 of these ring forts discovered across Ireland, and they are very impressive even to this day. Each of these kingdoms, Tua, is considered a small political unit with its own king, as I mentioned. An average Tua would have been around the size of about 5,000 members, so the size of my hometown, or if we want to put it in relation, we'll understand here, maybe the size of Port Allen or Addis, maybe not quite as large as Plaquemine, but around that small size. And despite the fact that the Tua is a rather small unit, it really is the center for almost all social, political, and religious interaction for its members. Before I move on to further units of the social structure, I want to emphasize that when I'm saying that these Tuas are living together, these aren't cities, they aren't organized villages per se. It's a lot of people in extended families living on various lands, but not necessarily together. It's not really until the Viking Age that Ireland starts developing settled cities that we think of today. And so I kind of want to get that image out of our mind, because we're not really talking about settled villages with streets. It's more farmsteads spread out, or houses that can easily be broken down and put back together as a herd of cattle move from place to place, or sheep move from place to place. So the Ri is not necessarily chosen through primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son inherits. The Ri is chosen from within the extended royal family known as the Geraldvina. And this is kind of a word for the certain family. And this includes the royal family down to 4 generations, so a huge amount of people. And because you can choose the king from amongst this many people, this leads to really fierce and bloody succession disputes. And so over time, to reduce the possibility of such bloody contests, the royal families start to appoint a Tanis Tuair as the heir while the king is still living. So the king can kind of designate his heir. And if anybody knows anything about Irish politics today, they still have an official within the Irish Parliament known as the Tanis Tuair. So that name has carried on. But in reality, this system of kingship, this Ri, is really a system of strongman rule. If a man outside of the royal family is powerful enough and wealthy enough, he can take the throne. There's nothing really to stop that from happening. Kings are crowned in special ceremonies that take place in sacred groves of trees in the local area. This ceremony, the information that we have about it, is really kind of a marriage between the king and the Tua. The king is married to the Tua, but he isn't necessarily king for the rest of his life. It's a certain amount of time. It's usually his entire life, but there are circumstances where a king is not king for his whole life. But the king is not necessarily only married to the Tua. Kings often have several marriages throughout their lifetimes to other people besides the Tua. Nobility at this time commonly practiced what is called serial monogamy, and then the practice of divorce. So, especially within the nobility, this doesn't necessarily happen amongst the lower classes. But after a king, a Ree, has been married to a woman and they have produced children or not, um, oftentimes a divorce will be obtained, and then a new wife will be married for either political or dynastic reasons. Now, this isn't saying anything bad about the previous wife. It isn't considered a shame. She would return to her family and she would oftentimes be married off in another political or dynastic marriage. This is a really normal practice, and it creates blood ties and connections between different Tuas, between different noble families, and between different kings. So it's a really common practice. And in fact, we'll talk about Brehon law a little bit more, but Brehon law is Irish law. And there are elaborate laws decreeing how the property of divorced couples will be divided, decreeing how divorce will happen, what will happen with children in divorce. And the fact that there are such elaborate laws discussing this show just how common and accepted divorce was within society. And so kings would often and nobles would often marry multiple women throughout their lifetimes, not bigamy necessarily, but just having large amounts of children with a variety of other people. And then that way your children are connected to other Tuas, to other kings, and to other noble families. So it just creates connections that is just good for society in general. So it's not to say that kings don't also have concubines, because that is also very common. And the sons of these unions were not able to inherit from the Tua. They were not considered part of the Geraldvina, the family. But what they do is they go on to enhance the ranks of the second rank of society, which would be our warrior class. And sometimes, depending on the concubine herself, the offspring might end up being a servant. It just sort of depends on where that person's station was in life. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about our warrior nobility. The warrior nobility is the second highest ranking echelon of early Irish society. And the status of a nobleman really depends on the number of clients or dependents that they can maintain. And this is based on wealth and power. And it's this class that would travel into battle on horseback or by chariot. And we know that they rode in by chariot because, well, they talk about it in the Táin. There's images inscribed on things of Irishmen on chariots, using those in warfare, as well as just accounts from other travelers who came to Ireland and traded. They saw these chariots. Early Irish history, even after the coming of Christianity, was full of conflicts between Tuas. It's a lot of clan warfare, because land is such a commodity, especially arable land is such a commodity. There is sort of this zero game sum that they think of. And so clan warfare is a very common occurrence in Irish history. And it's this loyalty of the warrior class that a Ree would depend on to support him in clan warfare. There are groups of the noble fighting classes that trained year long so that they were ready to fight if the king had need. These men, along with builders, would often erect forts around sort of the territory of the Tua to ensure that they don't have cattle raids or that they don't get snuck up upon. And for the most part, the lower classes in society did not engage in warfare, though obviously they were affected by the outcomes and might face ruin and death following some of this. But a lot of times when we think about warfare in medieval European society, it's this idea that the peasants get called in. and it's the peasants who are going out and fighting in the fields. And that is not the case with Irish society. Warfare is the prerogative of the nobility. They trained for it, they paid for it, and they benefited the most from its success. Ireland does also have a sort of idea of knighthood that exists in early Ireland. It wasn't necessarily called knighthood. What they referred to it as would have been taking valor. And it's not until the invasion of the Norman English in the 11th century that official knighthood really comes to Ireland. But the Ree would have some of these knight-like people that would surround him as sort of a body or a group of bodyguards that he would pay and that they would live in his household. And this sort of hired bodyguards are very common in Irish society. And in fact, they're still present in 17th century Irish society. I'm going to mention a couple of types of weapons that the Irish used in warfare. And then we're going to move on to some of our other elements of society. One of the most common weapons the Irish used were the spears. This is some of the oldest weapons that have been found in Ireland. They've been found in bogs as they were given as sacrifices, but they're found with bronze and iron spearheads. Also, one of the most common and something that's really associated with the Irish is the battle axe. This is some of the oldest weapons that they have. They found battle axe heads that are made of stone, bronze, copper, iron, and they've dated them back centuries before the coming of Christ. The Irish are particularly noted as being very deft with the axe, and actually comments from foreigners who have written accounts of the Irish say that they've seen the Irish practicing with both hands so that they can increase their dexterity with the weapon. So ambidextrous training. And this is the same thing with the use of swords. The Irish often trained with both hands with swords so that they could go between using a shield and a weapon depending on what was happening within war. The Irish were really fond of adorning their swords really elaborately, at least for those who could afford it. And normally it would be with gold and gems, but apparently a really common practice amongst the people who weren't as wealthy and couldn't afford gold and gems was to set the teeth of sea animals as the hilt of their sword, which is, I couldn't find a picture of it, but they say that they use the jaws of seahorses a lot of the time as the hilt of their sword, which I think just image-wise, that is really neat. And this actually was recorded by a Roman geographer, Solinus, in the 3rd century AD. So there's evidence of it having been done. They also use hand stones, just large stones that they would store inside their shields that they would throw in battle, rocks and slings. They did use bow and arrows, but apparently the short bow was not very popular in Ireland. But after the introduction of the Norman English invasion, they started to prefer the use of the 5-foot long bow over the short bow. And then, of course, they used the mace as well. We have reports that the Irish never really wore metal armor in battle before the 11th century when they started fighting with the Norman invaders. What we do have records of is that they would go into battle wearing a protective chest covering made from really hardened bull hide, so leather essentially, and then they would have leather greaves to cover their legs. They are also noted for wearing different types of helmets and carrying large round shields. Now, the Irish came into contact with the Vikings in around 800 AD, and it's believed that what the Normans were witnessing with these round shields was a carryover from the Viking era. It was sort of an adoption that the Irish took on, but based on shields and burial hoards that have been discovered in Ireland, which burials are less common just because a lot of the times the Irish would burn their dead. We see that these round shields were around far longer. They're much older than the Viking invasions. So it's not a carryover from the Vikings.